Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the seventh episode of Good Night and Good Luck, the Radio Bocconi program and podcast realized by the students of the 30469 Television and Culture course in Bocconi University. I am their very proud teacher, Andrea Quartarone. 7 days after our last episode, not so much has changed from the campaign point of view. Joe Biden is still the official president-elect. Donald Trump still refuses to concede, and the legal war continues, even if not in a very successful way for Donald Trump, without, for the moment, thanks God, has become a civil war. For us, it's time for some analysis with a cool head about the election. What does the election of Joe Biden properly means for America, and which lessons we can learn from this. Stay with us for the next hour. Before leaving the floor to Ennio Terrazzi Borghesan, who is the teaching assistant of the course and the playmaker of this radio program and the biggest star of this broadcast, is like a celebrity for us and not only for us. Let me say that from tomorrow on, the episode will be available on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcast, as all the previous ones. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You just have to look for Good Night and Good Luck 2020 on any platform possible. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very proud to introduce you Ennio Terrazzi Borghesan.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everybody. You mentioned that we have had 7 days since our last episode. It has been, in fact, 16 days since November 3rd, Election Day. Since then, COVID cases are spiking through the roof in the US. President Trump is mostly confined on Twitter, and he's avoiding the business of being simply presidential or appearing on camera. And President-elect Joe Biden is struggling to, as they say, hit the ground running in starting to shape up a transition through towards his administration. For these and many reasons, we have decided to center the seventh episode of Good Night and Good Luck around 6 questions, one per team. Questions that we think are reflective of what has been the 2020 journey so far and could be useful also to reflect on what lies ahead in the future. We will start now with Team Biden, with Lorenzo and Sofia. They will help us understand some reasons why Joe Biden has, in fact, won the 2020 presidential election.
Yes, to answer these questions, we should analyze different factors that brought Joe Biden to win the 2020 elections. Firstly, we will talk about Jen O'Malley-Dillon, his campaign manager, and after this, we will look at the role of swing states, and finally, we will discuss a particular case of split ticket. Jen O'Malley-Dillon, before joining Biden's campaign, was a founding partner at Precision Strategies, a communication, digital, and data targeting consulting firm. Her clients were including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada and Stacey Abrams, the leader of the Georgia House of Representatives. She was previously a deputy campaign manager for President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign and a battleground states director for the Obama 2008 campaign. Now she will assume the role of White House Deputy Chief of Staff under the Biden's administrations. As we said, in the 2020 elections, O'Malley-Dillon was Biden campaign manager, joining his campaign in March after Biden consolidated support among most of his primary rivals. She helped transforming a primary shoestring organization, which was struggled to raise money, into a general election juggernaut that ultimately made Donald Trump a one-term president. Within months, the campaign was transformed into a well-funded and highly disciplined operation. Notably, she also was the first woman to lead a winning Democratic presidential race. She found herself taking on tasks never handled before by a campaign, like setting up testing protocols due to the COVID pandemic and keeping her staff, especially a 77-year-old candidate, safe from a potentially deadly virus. Moreover, she had to run against a uniquely aggressive and unconventional incumbent president, and she won, securing the highest popular vote ever. As every brilliant strategist should do, Jen knows the battleground states like the back of her hands, but she also knows the Democratic Party mechanisms and organization. This helped her understand and know what type of data infrastructures was needed to build a solid consensus among the party and reach persuadable voters. The campaign members describe her as a master of both the old and traditional campaigning and the modern, the digital ways of campaigning. Dillon's essential strategic contribution for Biden was to stay relentlessly focused on reclaiming the blue wall states, namely Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which had narrowly swung to Trump in the 2016 elections against Hillary Clinton, eventually leading Trump to win. Biden's campaign spread the field, playing in Florida, Georgia, Ohio, and North Carolina, viewed as opportunities presenting themselves after the coronavirus hit and the bad management of the pandemic by President Trump. However, Dillon and Biden campaign resisted the temptation to spread their time and money too far. Dillon never wavered from the disciplined push to bring back the three states whose demographics line up well with Biden's appeal, and that could put a total of 46 electoral votes in his pocket. And indeed, they were the states that ultimately decided the elections. Biden, for instance, traveled to Pennsylvania 13 times, the triple his number of trips anywhere else. A Biden insider describes Dillon's strategy as one that, once seen the main opening, will make sure every detail is in place to follow through. As we said, Dillon's overwhelming priority is the inside game of political blocking and tackling. She doesn't love the spotlight, actually, and this gives Dillon's public statements an even greater weight. On October 14, for instance, with hype building about a possible Biden landslide, Dillon tweeted, and we quote, "We think this race is far closer than folks on this website think, like a lot closer." And actually, she was right. But fortunately for Biden, Dillon was right about a whole lot of other things too. From these analysis and considerations, we can grasp the importance that people in the campaign entourage and on the field have for ensuring a victory. Previously, indeed, I have quoted among the clients of Dillon's communication firm, Stacey Abrams, the member of the Georgia House of Representatives. And why do we remark on her? Because she played a crucial role in helping Biden gaining consensus in Georgia, one of the most contending to swing state. And I shall now leave the stage to Sofia, who indeed would talk us in depth about what happened in Georgia, but also in all the other swing states.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Lorenzo. So, talking about swing states, the most important are Georgia and Arizona, because these two states are are states that the Democrat Party has not won since the 90s. And then we have Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that are three states that are usually Democratic strongholds, but voted for Trump during 2016 elections. Joe Biden is the first Democratic candidate to win Georgia since 1992. And this win solidified Biden's victory, giving him a total of 306 votes in the Electoral College, matching President Donald Trump's 2016 total. At Mr. Trump referred to it landslide. 2020 campaign, a key figure, as Lorenzo said, was Stacey Abrams, the Democratic former candidate for Georgia governor, who helped Joe Biden ensure his victory in this state, which had been a Republican state until now. In fact, she is credited with motivating voters against Donald Trump. Moreover, in 2019, she wrote a document that gave Biden insights on strategies that would work for this specific state, where the electorate was leaning toward the Democrats but was not quite there yet. Moreover, Georgia Black voter support has been key to Biden's strength in this state. Then, talking about Arizona, Biden is just the second Democrat to win the state since 1948. Arizona was considered so reliably red in 2014 that a study by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of California labeled Mesa, that is a suburb of Phoenix, the most conservative American city. 3 fundamental shifts in the state helped the Democrats this year: a growing Latino population that leans democratic, a surge in voters moving to Arizona from more liberal states like California and Illinois, and how suburban voters have broken with the Republican Party led by Trump. By going blue, Arizona is moving closer to its neighbor to the northwest, Nevada, where Democrats have taken control of almost all aspects of government and away from the state traditionally red. Another reason Democrats believed they were competitive in Arizona was the coronavirus. In fact, before the pandemic, national Republican officials told the CNN there was no question. Arizona was a key battleground, but they were not concerned about Arizona turning blue. The best example that can be made about Arizona is about Maricopa County, that is the central county of Phoenix, which ensured the Democratic victory. Maricopa is the fastest growing county in the state, transforming over the last 2 decades into a sprawling mass of different communities. In fact, Biden was able to win here thanks to the voters of color, women, and traditionally underrepresented groups. Biden's administration strategy was exactly to move these groups towards the Democratic Party, and in the end, it was effective and successful. Talking generally, the vote of minorities helped Biden a lot during these 2020 elections. Moving on to Pennsylvania, and recalling what Lorenzo said previously, we can say that this state was fundamental for Biden. During his campaign, he visited not just the deeply democratic cities, but also areas where white working class electors had voted for Trump during the 2016 elections. Biden led the state by an edge than. However, areas around Philadelphia, more than 80% of citizens.
Sophia, forgive me. We have lost your audio for some second.
Oh, okay.
If you can retell the last 10-15 seconds more or less.
Okay, I start with Pennsylvania again.
Let's start from Pennsylvania. It's always a good idea.
So, talking about Pennsylvania, as I said, this is a state that was fundamental for Biden. And during his campaign, he visited not only the really democratic cities, but also cities and areas where white working class electors had voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Biden led the state by an edge of less than 1%. However, in the areas around Philadelphia, more than 80% of citizens voted for Biden, showing a mix of voters from different racial and economic classes stood in line to the defeat of a polarized president who worked for racial division. It was in fact the suburbs that gave Biden's most significant gains. The 4 Philadelphia color counties, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and Bucks, showed Biden a 50% increase from Clinton's 4 years ago. The counties showed both an increase in the electorate extension and in support for the Democratic presidential candidate. Generally speaking, this tendency that I described in these 3 states is real not only for swing states, but also for the rest of the country and the Democratic strongholds like California and New York. Minorities in particular helped Biden in his victory, and this is apparent also looking at the exit polls, which clearly show that around 70% of non-white voters supported Biden. Specifically, almost 90% of Black voters and 65% of Latinos voted for him. Furthermore, it's not surprising that 80% of people who described the American economy as not good or as poor voted for Biden. Generally, it is evident how people from minorities or people who feel underrepresented voted for Biden. But despite what happened in any singular state, Biden lost many Latino voters' trust as a general trend in the US. In return, he gained several votes from the suburbs and also everywhere from every demographic category. Suburbs really changed the elections outcome this year. A third factor that it is interesting to talk about is another general trend during this year's elections. Among all voters, there was a portion that we can describe as moderate, so people in the middle between Republicans and Democrats. And maybe many moderate voters decided to vote for Biden in the presidency, but voted for Republicans in the Congress. In this way, they split the ticket and clearly showed how numerous electors had lost trust in President Trump, but still believed in the Republican Party. This happened homogeneously in all states, and in a particular way, it occurred in Maine. In this state, Biden won with a 10-point margin, with 53.5% versus 43.5% of votes for Donald Trump. Meantime, Susan Collins, a moderate Republican, won again in the Senate, and as Biden obtained the state, Collins exceeded Trump by 7 percentage points, and her opponent, the Democrat Sarah Gideon, had little success. So these were the three main factors that led Biden winning this year. Obviously, there are many other factors, but we had to decide for the most important ones.
Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you.
From the reasons for a Biden win to the place of the United States in the world. Holly from Team Foreign Affairs will now guide us into understanding whether the US are coming out stronger or weaker from the result of the 2020 US elections.
Thank you, Ennio. So Joe Biden's victory can be seen as a great relief to some parts of the world. The new president-elect promises to make America a beacon again, defending human rights and contributing to the aiding of global crises such as coronavirus and climate change. But here's the question. Do you think this new cooperative, gentle, and accommodating attitude will make America look weak or make it stronger with more allies? According to Biden's vision, allies are key. He sees them as a multiplier of American influence. Now let me walk you through some of the important plans and goals in terms of foreign affairs that Biden wished to achieve after he takes the office. So first of all, Biden is reversing many of the environmental action that the Trump administration took for the past 4 years. He called climate change an existential threat to humanity and wishes to rejoin the Paris Agreement. 3 years ago, on June 1st, 2017, Donald Trump had pulled the US out of the Paris climate deal, saying that the Paris Accord will undermine the economy and put the US at a permanent disadvantage. But what is the Paris Agreement about? So according to UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement's central aim is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change and the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change. Joe Biden has previously announced that there will be a $2 trillion budget dedicated to help increase the use of clean energy and reduce fossil fuel emissions. He pledged to cut US emissions to net zero by the end of 2050. And then we have the issue of the participation in the WHO for the United States. So last April, former President Trump declared that the United States would withdraw from the World Health Organization after accusing the organization had failed to recognize and properly address the global pandemic of COVID-19. Since the founding of WHO in 1948, the US has been the largest contributor to the organization, providing 14.67% of the funding. In this case, apart from polio eradication, which takes as much as 36% of WHO's funding, the contribution from the US are used for outbreak and crisis response, vaccines of preventable diseases, and reproductive health. So for this reason, the failure of WHO in addressing COVID drove Trump into making the big decision of exiting the World Health Organization. However, in Biden's point of view, WHO still remains a globally fundamental organization, especially in the midst of a worldwide health crisis. So acknowledging the vital importance of the organization, President-elect Joe Biden wishes to return America's place in WHO. Then lastly, we have the nuclear pact with Iran. So back in 2015, when Mr. Trump took office, Iran's production of enriched uranium was limited by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was agreed between Iran, the US, the UK, Russia, France, China, and Germany. But after the United States withdrew from the agreement, Iran has resumed enriching uranium at high levels. And according to Atomic Energy Agency, it has now more than 8 times the limit set by the 2015 nuclear deal. So during the presidential campaign, Biden called Trump's decision of abandoning the deal reckless and that it ended up isolating the US instead of Iran. Despite Biden's wish to rejoin the nuclear deal, there are actually several barricades in doing so. So President of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, is facing strong opposition from the conservatives who demand a high price to return to the deal, including billions of dollars in compensation for the punishing sanctions imposed by Trump. Furthermore, the diplomats of Iran says that the nation would only return to full compliance with the deal when the United States also do the same. So that's it for Foreign Affairs for tonight. Thank you.
And your microphone. You're good looking, but you're...
It's always like that. Thank you, Holly, for providing us with some key issues of what lies ahead on the global stage for the US. Moving on, it is now the time of Patrick and Elena from Team Trump. They will have the task of making us understand why, in fact, President Trump is still refusing to concede the presidential race and is impeding the kickoff of a crucial transition of powers.
Right, good evening, everybody, and boy, oh boy, what a time to be alive. So, Donald Trump has taken his lame duck period by a storm with multiple legal challenges and accusations against the Democrats, and most importantly, his refusal to concede. Now, we're going to jump into cold water with Elena and try to see what on earth is going on. As we know, President Trump has a history of denying defeat and vigorous efforts in finding a scapegoat. He did recently admit in his speech that Mr. Biden had in fact won the elections, but still refuses to concede. Unheard of. He is currently honing his so-called victory on Twitter and takes ground in, once again, calling the elections a fraud. According to the Washington Post, he started his spree as early as in April, calling out the problems with mail-in ballots and a Democratic intervention. The election security officers have rejected Trump's fraud claims multiple times, and as of now, around 20 Republicans in Congress have congratulated Mr. Biden or accepted the call to action forward. This also reflects the division inside the party itself, which in turn propels the chaos even further. Trump, by implanting the idea of a rigged election into the minds of his supporters from early on, has solidified his support within the hardcore Trumpists. Trump's most recent claims are centered around Georgia and Michigan, where there has allegedly been missing batches of votes and baseless occurrence of more votes than voting people. And all these accusations are, as of today, baseless. Now, with the riots sparking across the nation in Trump's support, the fanfare on Democratic fraud is just fuel to the fire and one of Trump's last resorts in turning the scale to his direction. It may, in case, be that Trump is afraid of his own supporters, some of which blindly believe what he says, even when proven wrong. And as a former businessman, and with the alleged legalities he's about to face post-term, a furious base of supporters may be too much for Mr. Trump to handle personally. Igniting a large-scale chaos in several states by challenging the results and demanding recount, Trump is playing time and trying to be the man he claims to be, a man of the people, the least racist person he knows, and someone who loves the United States, simultaneously challenging the very basis of their nation by not conceding, that being democracy. Please, Elena.
So good evening, everybody. Thanks, Patrick, for this interesting analysis. And so I will continue on the topic of concession issue. So even if there isn't any written rule for that, it's a very rooted American tradition that the outgoing president explicitly concedes to the president-elect in order to favor a smooth transition of power and also to reassure the American citizens, especially the ones who voted for him. So it's a meaningful formality that still guarantees that democracy works and prevents any political violence. Indeed, no presidential candidate in modern history ever refused to concede. So actually deciding not to concede obstacles a lot the transitional process of power. So even if there is no certain explanation, of course, for Trump's behavior, some hypotheses still can be made. First of all, we can say that there is a big number of people, actually about 73 million of US citizens who voted for Trump. So this is the second highest number of votes in US history, and it means that he can count on really a big part of the US population that still believes in him. So not conceding then means that he is allowing these people to think that there is still hope for Trump to be president. So the message is the war is not over. And also he has a strong support, as Patrick said, in the GOP party. So actually out of the 26 Republican governors, just few clearly recognized Biden as president-elect. Most of the others said nothing at all, mostly because they govern in conservative states with a vast majority of Trump supporters. But a consistent number of Republican governors actually fully supported Trump's behavior and his allegations. So we could say that right now, Trump has nothing to lose. He's trying out every way possible to extend the uncertainty and to exploit the juridical system of the US to legitimize himself. In addition, it's clear that his decision not to concede has consequences on Biden's legitimacy. Trump voters are right now more likely not to recognize Biden as their president. And also, there are some examples of foreign political chiefs that haven't recognized Biden as the president, so that haven't congratulated him. Among them, we have Putin, Xi Jinping, Erdogan, and Bolsonaro. Going back to find some reasons that can explain why Trump is behaving this way, as we see a behavior of clear denial of defeat, some psychologists suppose that Trump's behavior is to be linked not only to political reasons, but also to his personal attitude. So he's been defined as a grandiose narcissist, and not only he has fired many numbers of his staff, but also he is reluctant right now to admit defeat, even when the battle is hopelessly lost. Indeed, accepting defeat would mean that his inflated self-esteem would be kind of destroyed. So even if we are not able to know exactly why he is so tenaciously going against such an important American tradition, which is the concession speech, we can affirm that this would have consequences on the US population, and they would be bad consequences since the population is already struggling with a worsening pandemic. So the best thing to do for the common good would be to hand off a functioning executive branch to the commander-in-chief in order to allow the incoming administration to formulate effective policies and to focus on COVID handling. But for the moment, we, of course, just have to wait and see what will happen next.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Patrick. the United States have reached this week, in fact, yesterday, on Wednesday, what can be said as an infamous landmark. 250,000. Yeah. Sorry for my.
Bravo. Yeah.
So the United States have reached yesterday, Wednesday the 18th, what can be called as an infamous landmark. 250,000 people have died of COVID-19. Just yesterday, the US have also registered 170,000 cases in a single day, and more than 1,900 people have died in a single day. Francesco and Martina from Team US Affairs will help us understand whether, in fact, COVID-19 has have an impact or have influenced the result of the 2020 elections.
Yeah, good night, everyone. We all know that the arrival of the pandemic has changed the lives of many people and interrupted the one of many others. So it undoubtedly modified their way of thinking. But the question is, was the virus able to change their political party too? Well, the campaigns have been held in a totally different way compared to the models of the previous years. And it has changed the general feedback of the politics of the president in power. So let's deep in and analyze how the two main parties have been affected by the arrival of this huge event. Now I leave the floor to Francesco, who is going to talk about the Republican Party.
Hi, good night, everybody. Thank you, Martina, for this introduction. Well, let's start with the Republican standpoint. COVID-19 has played for sure a major role in determining the electoral outcome. However, there are divergent opinions on whether the pandemic has played a positive or a negative effect on the number of voters. Many Republicans claim that Biden was favored by the pandemic because it reduced the impact of his weaknesses, for example, allowing him to skip big rallies that almost certainly would have been smaller than Trump's. So he was better rested, hosting fewer events, so he made fewer errors as well, and even fewer of them on camera. Indeed, in the past, Joe Biden has stumbled several times in gaffes and slips, to which he then had to return to apologize. Moving on, for what concerns Trump's management of the pandemic instead, the president has repeatedly claimed he has done a great job of handling the virus and focusing on the recovery, therapeutics, and vaccines in development. But October made it even more difficult for him to avoid addressing the growing numbers of infections after he contracted COVID-19, and many White House and campaign staffers tested positive, including 5 of Vice President Mike Pence's top aides. On the other hand, fears about economy under COVID lockdown helped Trump outperform polls. According to The Guardian, for example, one of Trump's primary lines of attack on his opponent was that he would lock down the economy again and make the US into a prison state. Since in many areas, such as rural upper Midwest, people were experiencing the economic effects more than the health effects of the pandemic, the president's clear line against lockdowns reassured workers in those areas. As a result, early data appear to show that Trump's support has actually increased in rural America. So now I will leave the floor to Martina, my colleague, to have a Democrat perspective analysis. Please, Martina.
Thank you, Francesco. And after looking at the Republican side, we can now analyze the question from a Democratic perspective. COVID-19 proved to be one of the most decisive themes of the 2020 American elections and therefore of Biden's victory. Joe Biden has described Trump's handling of the COVID-19 as totally irresponsible and points to Americans' health as the nation's top domestic issue. Trump downplayed the potential human and economic impact of the outbreak, and he classified the virus as very similar to any flu. Then Biden took advantage of public's disappointment about how the president had handled the COVID emergency, accusing him of having failed in warning Americans immediately of the severity of the virus, which has caused the death of nearly 300,000 people, which is a huge number. And this has led to a shift in favor of Biden, especially for voters over the age of 65. And according to a CNN poll, Biden has 60% of the votes among the so-called silver voters, of which 78% consider the coronavirus epidemic as an extremely important factor in choosing the president. If President Trump's measures to contain the virus have been minimal, Biden's campaign adopted a more cautious approach and endorsed strategies like constant social distancing and the use of masks. And a proof of the seriousness with which Biden treated the coronavirus topic was the fact that he kept interaction between people to a minimum. In fact, his campaign organized virtual rallies, socially distanced events with smaller group of supporters, and the Democratic National Conventions themselves were beamed in from across the country. And pre-recorded speeches were streamed for the millions of voters who were watching the event live. And many Americans have chosen to put their hopes on Biden, whose campaign proposes investing $25 billion in a vaccine manufacturing and distribution plan, which Biden guarantees it will get to every American, and that will be cost-free. So that's all from Team US Affairs, and thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you, Francesco. It is now time to move to a different segment of today's episode, one dedicated to media, both traditional and social media. The role into the 2016 elections has been largely debated, as well as their possible influence into the final outcome. We will have two groups now discussing from their respective perspective. First, Julia and Ray for Team Old Media, then Francesca and Esther from Team New Media will answer whether media, either mainstream or social, have learned from their respective lessons from 2016.
Good night, everyone. So, as many know, Donald Trump's relationship with TV and media started way before his 2016 presidential candidature. One could actually argue that his whole career has been primarily a media career. Indeed, preceding the days of The Apprentice, the show that significantly increased his notoriety, his first media appearances, consisting in tabloid exploits and talk shows, date back to the 80s. The turning point that created his personal brand, by transforming a regular businessman into the character of Donald Trump, came in January 2004, when The Apprentice was first aired on NBC. From there on, Mr. Trump became a true TV personality, gaining popularity among the public and paving the way for his future political agenda. When considering the 2016 election campaign, we can in fact claim that the media had a huge role in Donald Trump's victory. The president gained the most time on TV channels like ABC, NBC, and CBS, not only more than his opponent Hillary Clinton, but actually more than any other president in the American history. TV gave much unfiltered airtime to Donald Trump because they realized his incredible ability to increase ratings, a winning situation for both actors. In particular, Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, by constantly broadcasting him, although in a negative way, helped force Trump, the politician, into the same profile of Trump, the businessman, a TV star, a ratings magnet. A main factor leading to Trump's success in the media environment was that he constantly benefited from earned media, that is, news and commentary concerning his campaign circulating on TV, in newspapers, and on new digital media. Earned media, indeed, many times overshadows typical paid media during a campaign. The main difference between President Trump and the other candidates is that he is much better at earning media. To put it into numbers, Mr. Trump gained free media attention worth nearly $2 billion, the highest amount of all the presidential campaigns in political history. In addition, Trump achieved higher levels of coverage, 15% more than Clinton, because of his controversial and unpredictable statements, highly in opposition to Clinton's expected and quite ordinary ones. At the same time, very often the media ignore Clinton's political agenda, while focusing on negative news, like the email scandal, that constantly outweighed the positive ones. Although both candidates received negative press, Trump managed to gain a positive coverage the 2 weeks preceding the election. As for his social media communication, Trump's online voice was winning by far as the public perceived in his online interaction, passion, power, enthusiasm, and constant openness for discussion. Now, by remaining on the topic of the 2016 election, one of the first things that comes to our mind is the Russiagate controversy. Indeed, it is impossible to forget that period in which each development, twist, and turn of Robert Mueller's investigation was reported by journalists all around the world, as citizens waited for a verdict. In March 2019, Mueller concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to accuse any member of the Trump campaign of having conspired with representatives of the Russian government in order to interfere in the 2016 election. But in the meantime, during the whole length of the investigation, Trump was once again at the center of media coverage. In this case, Trump's constant denial just put more fuel on the fire, providing him with more media coverage and visibility. Although some mistakes occurred in the coverage of this scandal, as many journalists underlined, what resulted overall was more fame for Trump. Indeed, media spent 2 years investigating alongside the Mueller report and sank so many resources into that effort just to finally come up with nothing. That is the reason why a media critic said, quote, "If I were Donald Trump, I'd be tweeting, 'Thank you, US media, for looking so deeply into this.'" After the 2016 electoral campaign, the media's response to Trump's presidency also remained marked by strong obsession with him. This can be demonstrated with many examples. In fact, taking the New York Times as reference, in 2019, the word Trump was the 4th most used word in the entire publication, including sports, food, and travel sections. We can immediately see the point by comparing this data with the one from Obama's presidency, whose name, 2 years after his election, was only the 40th most used word. This suggests that very little was published without referencing Trump, and this because there has been a record spike in paid subscriptions over the last 4 years. The media has been constantly paying to Trump the same amount of attention during these 4 years as they would have paid to any presidential candidate during his election campaign. It is as if Trump has ceased to be just a news topic and became the very lens through which we interpret and discuss everything. The relationship between Trump and the media is one of tough love. Both hate each other, but neither party can live without the other. And the Americans love this show. Everything Trump says is newsworthy, and if this, as we have seen, appears to be a benefit to the media, it could prove to be a disadvantage to the American people. In fact, the media is constantly so distracted by gossip-type news related to Trump that it forgets to really cover the important news, making them appear as not so significant. A striking example might be provided by the time when Trump claimed that he himself was taking hydroxychloroquine to prevent contracting COVID. He did it to get the media to focus on this news and overlook the ongoing scandal over the dismissal of Inspector General Steve Linick, who was investigating Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and more in general, distract the media from the very bad handling of the pandemic. However, many other scandals have gotten little attention. Maybe the media was giving him the pass because it presumed that he was the underdog for the election year, but as 2016 showed, this was definitely a risky game. I will now leave the floor to my colleague Ray that will lead you through the most recent events concerning our topic.
Thank you, Julia. Good night, everyone. Now, passing on to the actual way in which Mr. Trump communicates, as we all know, has a very particular type of communication that is simple but very direct. In fact, maybe too direct sometimes. A Stanford's professor claimed that Trump's authoritative voice and way of speaking has built his image as a man who knows better. He always puts his opinions front and center, implying a decisive style of governance. Thus, this type of communication has clearly a huge influence on the masses, tending to be very provocative. The huge mediatic freedom that was given to him led Trump to expand his language onto another level by using insults, strong critiques, and often exposing false claims in order to rouse the public and gain visibility. This attitude, however, often led to negative effects such as tumult, chaos, and many complaints from his opponents. For this reason, in the last few months, the media decided to control much more Trump's communication by fact-checking him and by implementing new rules. For example, in the second presidential debate, the candidates' microphones were turned off when it was the opponent's turn to speak due to his previous arrogant attitude and his disregard on timing. The media's tolerance to Trump's false claims culminated on Thursday night during the elections when, in one of his speeches, he illegitimately declared victory. At that point, several US news networks decided to cut his speech and announced publicly the untruthfulness of his claim. In fact, certain popular networks such as MSNBC halted its live stream of the speech just a few minutes in, announcing, "Here we are again, in the unusual position of not only interrupting the President of the United States, but correcting the President of the United States." This has probably been one of the first times in history that media dared to cut off one of the candidates' speeches during the elections due to their inaccuracy. Another network that used a similar strategy was Fox News, a good example to think of if we consider the long and complex relationship between the network and Donald Trump. If before Fox News seemed to have a kind of beneficial partnership between them and Trump, creating a lot of buzz around its credibility and the general topic of fake news, the recent events of the past few days changed it. This time, Fox News showed their unwillingness to further support Trump and his unfounded statements that he keeps creating, thus pointing out to their ethics. Fox News host Neil Cavuto cut away from White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany's press conference, where she was trying to accuse the election system of fraud and unfairness by providing a so-called proof. Cavuto interrupted her, stating that, "Whoa, I just think we have to be very clear." She's charging that the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't, in good countenance, continue showing you this. This unfair voting actually originally comes from Trump, who claimed in his Twitter that Pennsylvania and other sufficient states received thousands of illegal votes. And perhaps it could take an unexpected turn and evolve into a bigger problem if major TV networks didn't refuse to translate and interrupt his speech about conspiracy theories. With this ultimate event, it's clear that despite the strength and influence of Trump's communication, the media is starting to get fed up with Trump's disrespectful attitude, leading them to restrict his freedom of speech. Who knows? The only thing we know for now is that Trump didn't like it as well and decided to start accusing the networks in spreading in the fake news. But this is another story, which we may talk about next time. So stay tuned. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Francesca and Esther, who are going to evaluate the representation of elections both in 2016 and this year from the perspective of social media.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Julia. So we are gonna talk about the role of social media in the US election. But in order to understand the present, we are gonna start from the past. So in 2016, United States presidential election campaign between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton marked a significant change in how social media have been used as news sources for the public. While social media have been applied in recent elections, the 2016 general election became what is considered the most influential in terms of changing technology and personable online interaction. The presidential election saw social media platforms experiment with never before seen features. Facebook, for example, rolled out their Get Ready for Election Day feature on October 28, designed to give voters a personalized voting guide. The feature meant users could favorite candidates and policies of their choice, so when they reached the polling booths on election day, they could refer to their guide as a digital how-to-vote card.
Yeah, that is true. Plus, presidential candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's own Facebook page were used to share live videos, voting prompts, and other content. Despite the best efforts of the Clinton party, Trump was consistently in the spotlight throughout the presidential election campaign. As the American news commentator Van Johns put it, every political era is shaped by the media environment of its time. The most successful politicians have an innate understanding of that environment and the skill to act on it. As for measurable results, Facebook's claim that their platform helped to register more than 2 million voters in the US that potentially allowed Clinton to win the popular vote, not Trump. It also might have been the difference between Trump winning some of the crucial states, including Ohio and Florida. The reason behind it is that the majority of millennials prefer to receive their news on social media than any other media platform. Already from 2016, we have been seeing social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat gain more influence over traditional media platforms such as TV and radio.
But now let's move to 2020. In order to better depict the use of social media in this year's election, we decided to report some analysis conducted by Professor Patrick Edgan, actually teaching politics and public policy at the New York University, who specialized in US political attitudes and behavior and their consequence for public policy, partnership, and identity. He has worked for the 2020 election as an elections analyst for NBC News as part of the network's Exploit Pool Desk team. During this interview, he has talked about the role of social media in US politics, focusing on the impact of the 2020 presidential campaign. And in particular, he highlighted 3 themes about social media, right?
Yeah, what in fact emerged from the interview was the following. The first is that social media has become a very, very important source for the news in American politics. The second is that social media is a virtually unmediated way for politicians to talk to their followers, which means that they leap over the traditional gatekeeping and filtering role that the media play in terms of helping people to understand political races. Then he talked more thoroughly about social media. He mentioned Twitter and the fact that it remains a key tool for Trump. He said that Trump's tweets, as many of you probably know, particularly at the beginning of any given day, can often change the entire news cycle for that day. Twitter remains an incredibly powerful tool for him to make decisions about what people are going to talk about that day in the news. And therefore, now, the news is going to cover politics. Moreover, he said that no other politician has or will have that kind of power throughout 2020. Twitter will continue to be an important tool for him.
Yes, it's right. And he also collected some data from Pew Research Center as a search of data on how Americans get their news from social media, which reported that Americans use different online platforms. At the top is Facebook, then Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. The latter is just used by about 1 out of the 5 every Americans, even though the Twitter looms large in journalists' minds and certainly in academics' minds, but ordinary Americans, a lot of people, are not really tuned into Twitter. He underlined that it's just a little over half of Americans in 2019 who say that they get their news from social media sources. So we still have half of Americans that doesn't. If on the one hand, young people under 30 see social media as a source of political information, we also have to remember this year's election were the first one in which Generation Z was able to play a concrete role in the vote. On the other hand, the most important source of news for many older Americans remains television, so TV should not be discounted as an important way that Americans learn about political news, even in the era of social media. So we can then see how the impact of social media was more varied in 2020 than in 2016.
Yeah, and furthermore, the sources that the Democrats and Republicans rely on consist in very different streams of news, which give to the two groups very different outlooks to understand the world and share political news with people who have the same political thought. Now, let's shift from the approach social media's consumer adopted to the several measures social media introduced in order to seem more reliable. The improvements were several, we can't deny it. Instagram, for example, declared the removal of the recent tab from hashtag pages only for people in the US, explicating its purpose to reduce the spread of misinformation, just 1 week before election's date. But Twitter was probably the site which put into action the most significant initiative, declaring that from October 27th to November 11th, it labeled some 300,000 tweets as part of its civic integrity policy. The amount to around 0.2% of the total number of election-related tweets sent during that 2-week period. Definitely a great number.
And by the way, beside these positive points, All the experts still agree on declaring that social media may have survived election day, but their test can be defined and ended once for all, and therefore must remain constant if you want to avoid a heavy proliferation of fake news.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Francesca. And thank you, Esther. Your contribution and the 7th episode of Good Night and Good Luck. We plan to have 2 episodes remaining in the upcoming weeks, and we invite you to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Gnagle2020. I leave now the floor to Andrea for his final remarks.
Thank you so much, Ennio. Thank you all. As usual, I want to thank the newsroom, this extraordinary group of 35 students that are doing this sort of magic, creating these, I think, always pretty interesting radio and podcast program. I want to thank Radio Bocconi and Bocconi Arts and Humanities committees for their collaboration and support. For the moment, take care and stay safe. From me, Ennio, and everyone, good night and good luck.